Under the cold gray sky, the world gathered to witness a man who believed he was untouchable. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted his name, but I heard none of it. All I felt was the quiet strength that carried me through every sleepless night, every betrayal, every moment I held my children while the world mocked my name. In Judge Evelyn Grant's chambers, a sealed DNA envelope waited, holding the truth that would tear his perfect world apart. I lifted my head steady and unshaken. Today, I was no longer the woman he tried to break. Today, I would be the one to end him. I walked toward the courthouse steps, the sound of my heels sharp against the stone. The crowd had already gathered, a restless sea of reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers. Flashes lit up the gray morning sky, as if the world was desperate to capture every second of my humiliation. I kept my chin high and my expression calm, because I knew something they didn't. A black town car pulled up at the curb. It was sleek, gleaming like a trophy. The door opened and Daniel Carter stepped out as if this was his stage. At 45, he looked every bit the billionaire people believed him to be. Broad-shouldered, immaculate in a navy suit that cost more than most people's yearly salaries. His hair, perfectly combed and touched with just enough silver, lent him the aura of power he so carefully cultivated. Then came June Parker. She was 30, striking in that deliberate, polished way only money could buy. Her cream-colored dress hugged her figure, her heels clicking elegantly as she slid her arm through his. She tilted her chin ever so slightly, a quiet declaration of victory. Together, they posed without posing, their smiles sharp enough to cut. Reporters shouted questions, cameras popped like fireworks. Daniel basked in it, offering his trademark smile, the one that used to make me feel safe. Now I could only see the arrogance underneath. He didn't even glance at me at first. When he finally did, it was quick, a smirk that said everything. "You're done, Emily." I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My fingers pressed against the file in my hand until the edges dug into my skin, grounding me. That envelope sitting on Judge Evelyn Grant's desk was all I needed. Sealed, untouched, and devastating. David had told me last night that Daniel wouldn't see it coming. He was too convinced of his cleverness, too used to bending the world to his will. He would walk into that courtroom thinking he'd already won, and that was exactly what I wanted. Emily David's voice pulled me back. He was just a step behind, calm as ever, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his briefcase gripped tightly. His quiet presence was the opposite of Daniel's theatrics. I nodded once, not trusting my voice yet. "Stay steady," he said softly. "Let him smile. He has no idea what's coming." A gust of cold wind swept through the crowd, carrying with it the hum of reporters and the click of camera shutters. I looked at Daniel again, watching him laugh at some question shouted from the press. June leaned into him perfectly, rehearsed, perfectly complicit. The sight used to hurt. Now it only hardened me. Helen's voice crept into my thoughts, uninvited but sharp. My mother had pleaded with me weeks ago. "Maybe you should just take the settlement, Emily. Don't drag this out. You can't fight him." But she hadn't seen the email. She hadn't seen the line where Daniel's lawyer outlined his plan to strip me of everything, to take my children from me. That was the moment I stopped being afraid. Daniel straightened his tie and finally turned his full attention on me. He smirked, tilting his head slightly like he was acknowledging a defeated opponent. I held his gaze cold and unblinking. His smirk deepened, mistaking my stillness for weakness. I let him think it. David moved closer, his shoulder brushing mine. "We're ready," he murmured. I exhaled slowly, my breath curling in the chill morning air. Behind Daniel, June whispered something in his ear, and he laughed sharp and hollow. I imagined how that laugh would sound when it cracked under the weight of truth. One of the reporters turned toward me. "Emily, do you have anything to say before the hearing?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Silence was my shield. Every word would come later, not from my mouth, but from the numbers on that piece of paper in Judge Grant's hands. I thought of Liam and Chloe. Their faces last night when I kissed them goodnight, Chloe clinging to my arm asking if I'd be okay, I had smiled at her then, steady and sure, because I needed her to believe it. I needed to believe it too. Daniel started up the courthouse steps, June beside him, the press scrambling to follow. He glanced over his shoulder once more, almost casually, as though checking to see if I would trail after him like I used to. I didn't move. Instead, I let the moment. I let him enjoy it. Every step he took brought him closer to the truth that would tear his perfect world apart. David touched my elbow lightly. "It's time." I nodded, and together we moved forward. The noise of the crowd dulled around me as I climbed the stairs. Step by step, I felt my fear fall away, replaced by something colder, sharper. Halfway up, I caught Daniel watching me again. For just a split second, there was a flicker in his expression, the smallest crack in his composure, before he smoothed it over with another smug smile. I didn't smile back. I reached the top of the steps and paused. The courthouse doors stood in front of me, tall and heavy, but I didn't feel their weight. Not anymore. I pushed one open, the sound of the hinges loud in my ears. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter. Marble floors muted voices, the faint scent of polished wood and old paper. David's footsteps followed close behind, steady and reassuring. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Daniel could enjoy his little parade outside. Soon enough, the only thing he'd hear would be the sound of Judge Grant reading the words that would strip the smile off his face. I walked forward, head high, my heart steady as steel. The war hadn't been won yet, but the first shot had already been fired, and he didn't even know it. I still remember the day I married Daniel, as clearly as if it were yesterday. It was 2010, a warm afternoon in Napa Valley, and I stood in a lace gown beneath a canopy of white roses while he slipped a ring onto my finger. He was confident, charismatic, the kind of man who could walk into any room and draw every eye. Back then, I believed in him. I believed in us. I left my job as an art curator in New York and followed him to California so he could grow Titan Data Systems into the empire he always talked about. For a while, everything felt like the dream we had promised each other. We bought a home in Atherton with wide glass windows and a garden where I planted lavender that never seemed to survive the heat. When Liam was born, and 2 years later Chloe, I thought my life was perfect. I traded gallery openings and late-night research for bedtime stories and school pickups, and I told myself I was happy because that was what love was supposed to be. But in 2022, the cracks began to show. They didn't start with shouting or accusations. They began in silence. Daniel started coming home later and later, claiming back-to-back meetings at Titan. At first, I believed him. He was building a company that had the eyes of Silicon Valley on it, and I wanted to be supportive. But then came the phone. He never left it on the counter anymore. He carried it everywhere, even into the bathroom. He changed his password. I asked him once, my voice quiet, because I already hated the answer I knew was coming. "Why the new password, Daniel?" He didn't look at me. He was tying his tie in the mirror. He said something about security updates, about Titan's new policies. Then he kissed me on the cheek, that absent kind of kiss you give someone without thinking, and walked out the door. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself not to overthink it. But the scent was the thing I couldn't ignore. It was faint at first, clinging to his shirts when he came home late. Jasmine, not my perfume. It was heavier, muskier, like it belonged to someone who wanted to be noticed. I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe someone at the office wore it. Maybe it clung to him by accident. One night I mentioned it to my mother, Helen. We were sitting in her kitchen while Chloe played on the floor with her dolls. "Mom does. It seems strange to you. The hours, the perfume." She sighed, stirring sugar into her tea. "Emily, men with demanding jobs get distracted. You can't make yourself sick worrying about every little thing." I nodded because I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe I was imagining things. But deep down, the unease had already started to take root, and no amount of reassurance could pull it out. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon when I was paying bills. I opened our joint credit card statement expecting to see the usual charges from Titan lunches and hardware stores. But there it was. La Perla, $700. I stared at it for a long time, the numbers sharp and clear. Daniel had never once bought me lingerie. He didn't even know my size. My fingers went numb against the paper. When he came home that night, I waited for him in the kitchen. "Daniel, what's this?" I held the statement up. He glanced at it like it was nothing. "A gift for a client." His voice was smooth, too smooth. "She closed a big deal for Titan." It was a thank you. I almost laughed. "You bought a client lingerie?" He frowned. Then the way he always did when he wanted to make me feel unreasonable. "It's not what you think, Emily. It was just a gesture." I didn't believe him, but I didn't fight either. I swallowed the words pressing against my tongue, the sharp questions that would have started a war. Instead, I nodded and let him walk past me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while he slept soundly beside me. I thought about the Daniel I married, the man who used to bring me coffee in bed on Sundays and kiss my shoulder before I woke up. I thought about the way he had smiled at me on our wedding day, like I was the only thing that existed. And I wondered when that man had vanished. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror brushing my hair while Chloe knocked on the door asking for breakfast. I looked at myself at the woman staring back, and I didn't recognize her. There were faint lines around my eyes now. My smile felt like something I wore for other people, not something I felt. I told myself to hold it together for the kids, for Liam and Chloe. But I kept seeing the statement from La Perla in my mind. And in that quiet, relentless way, a thought I had been avoiding finally settled in. Something was wrong. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to keep pretending it wasn't. It was raining the night everything changed, the kind of rain that patters against the windows and makes the world outside feel distant and hollow. Chloe was curled up at the kitchen table, her hair damp from her bath coloring in a workbook for school. I sat beside her, scrolling through the family iPad to answer an email from her teacher. That was when it appeared. A new message flashed at the top of the screen. Marcus Hill, Daniel's lawyer. The subject line read, "Nightfall Strategy." I froze. My finger hovered over the screen. Marcus was supposed to email Daniel, not me. The only reason this message had shown up was because Daniel had once used the family iPad for his work account and never logged out. I told myself not to open it, that it was private, but my hand was trembling before I could even stop it. I tapped. The email unfolded in neat black lines against a white screen, and with every word my chest tightened. Asset relocation complete. Remaining funds will be transferred to Cayman accounts within the week. Phase 2, media strategy finalized. Recommend we leak preliminary rumors regarding Emily Carter's infidelity to shift public narrative. Phase 3, petition for custody supported by motion to compel paternity testing. This will discredit her and secure primary parental rights for you. My vision blurred. I blinked hard, reading it again and again until the letters carved themselves into my mind. $120 million. My husband. My children. My name dragged through the mud like I was nothing but an obstacle to be eliminated. Chloe looked up at me. "Mom, can you help me with this one?" Her voice was small and innocent, cutting through the roar in my head. I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "In a second, sweetheart." I stroked her hair, steadying my hand, and turned the iPad slightly so she could not see. I took a screenshot, my breath coming shallow and sharp. I sent it to myself, my fingers moving fast, almost mechanical. Then I deleted the email from the inbox and emptied the trash. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might crack my ribs. I stared at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. The woman looking back at me didn't look scared anymore. She looked like someone I barely recognized, someone stripped of the illusions that had been holding her together. The door opened, and Daniel's voice carried through the hallway. "Chloe, there's my girl." Chloe leapt from her chair, racing toward him. He kissed her cheek like he was the perfect father, and for a moment I almost believed he still was. Then his eyes met mine over her head, cool and detached, and I knew better. Dinner was quiet. He talked about a new deal at Titan, something about investors and expansion. I nodded in the right places, smiled when I had to, and never said a word about the email. He didn't notice the difference, or maybe he didn't care. Later that night, when the house was silent and the kids were asleep, I sat alone in the living room. The rain was still falling, tapping softly against the glass. I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshot again. I read it until the rage stopped burning hot and turned cold, instead sharp and clear. I thought about every sacrifice I had made for him, the career I left behind, the nights I stayed awake with the kids while he built his empire, the way I defended him when people whispered about his temper or his endless late hours. And now he was going to take my children from me and paint me as something vile. He thought I would break. I didn't. I reached for a notepad and started writing. Names, numbers, steps. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew this: I wasn't going to let Daniel Carter bury me. When I finally stood and turned off the lights, I felt a strange calmness settle over me. The fear was gone, burned away. The woman who had once begged for scraps of his affection no longer existed. In her place was someone else entirely. Someone who was ready for war. The next morning I drove into San Francisco with my hands tight on the steering wheel and a file of screenshots sitting in the passenger seat. The city skyline loomed in the distance, gray and sharp against the overcast sky. I parked outside a modest brick building tucked between glass towers. On the brass plaque by the door, it read, David Chen Family Law. David looked almost exactly as I remembered him from college, only sharper, more composed. His office was neat sunlight spilling over rows of case files stacked in perfect order. When he saw me, he rose from behind his desk, and his expression shifted from polite professionalism to quiet concern. "Emily, you look like hell," he said gently. I laughed once, a sound that felt strange in my throat. "That's about right." We sat. I slid the iPad across the desk, my finger pointing to the screenshot of Marcus Hill's email. He read it without a word, his jaw tightening the further down he went. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled sharply. "This is worse than I imagined. He's not just divorcing you, he's trying to erase you." I nodded. "I won't let him." David tapped his fingers against the desk, thinking fast. "We need proof. We need to dismantle every part of his case before he even files it. And if he wants to question paternity, we give him the one thing he will not see coming. ADN. Exactly. We get the test first, quietly. When he tries to humiliate you in court, it will backfire on him in front of the judge." I stared at him, my chest tight but steady. "Can we do it without him knowing?" David smiled, thin and sharp. "I know a private investigator who has handled worse." That was how Frank Miller came into my life. 2 days later, I met him in a small office in Daly City. Frank was in his 50s, grizzled, the kind of man who looked like he had seen too many ugly truths and stopped being surprised by any of them. "You need DNA without him suspecting," he said flatly. "Office coffee cups are easiest. He tosses one, I'll get it. Clean, uncontaminated." I nodded. "Thank you." That night after the kids were asleep, I stood in the doorway of Liam's room. He was 13, his hair a mess, his face relaxed in sleep. I crept closer, heart aching in a way I couldn't explain. I bent down gently, snipping a small lock of his hair and slipping it into a sterile envelope. I moved to Chloe's room. She was 10, curled up under her blanket, clutching her stuffed rabbit. I kissed her forehead softly, then cut a strand of her hair too. My hands shook not from fear, but from the weight of what I was doing. Back in my room, I added my own sample. I placed everything into a small bag and sealed it tight. I stared at it for a long time before calling David. "It's done." "Good," he said. "I'll have the lab expedited. No mistakes." 3 days later, I sat in my car outside the grocery store when my phone buzzed. It was an email from David. Subject line: results. I opened it. The report was clinical, nothing but numbers and probabilities. But at the bottom it was clear. Daniel Carter. Liam Carter. 99.9%. Daniel Carter. Chloe Carter. 99.999%. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in weeks I exhaled, without feeling like my lungs were collapsing. It was not relief. It was something colder, sharper. The fear that had haunted me since the night I opened Marcus Hill's email was gone. In its place was focus. David called a minute later. Emily, we have it. This is our weapon. I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. My face was calm. He's going to bury himself with it, I said quietly. David didn't disagree. That night I tucked Liam and Chloe into bed, kissed their foreheads, and lingered for a moment just to watch them breathe. I thought of Daniel smug and certain, and for the first time I felt no panic, no grief, only resolve. I turned off the hallway light and went downstairs. Outside the rain had started again, steady against the windows. I stood there in the quiet, the envelope of truth now lodged in my email like a silent blade. The first move was mine, and I intended to make it count. The headlines hit like a punch to the chest. Billionaire Daniel Carter fights for his children. Faithless wife exposed. I stared at my phone, the glow of the screen painting the kitchen in cold light, while the coffee on the counter went untouched. Every major outlet had a version of the story. Photos of Daniel in his Navy suit stepping out of Titan data systems framed him as a devoted father and a victim. There was no mention of June. They erased her, the mistress turned invisible, while I was painted as a liar. By the time I opened social media, the comments were worse. Strangers dissecting my life with casual cruelty. They called me greedy, unfit, shameless. I should have looked away, but I read every word until my stomach twisted so tightly I could barely breathe. When the phone rang, I snatched it up like a lifeline. It was my mother. "Emily," she said softly, "I saw the news." I closed my eyes. Her voice was hesitant, heavy with something I didn't want to name. "Mom, you don't believe any of it." There was silence, then a quiet sigh. I don't know what to believe anymore." The words landed like a slap. I forced my voice to stay even. "Just give me time. I'll fix this." I hung up before my composure cracked. For a long moment, I stood there in my kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound, my hands shaking at my sides. Daniel hadn't just poisoned the public against me. He'd turned my own mother into someone who wasn't sure if I was telling the truth. But I didn't cry. I couldn't. The next morning, I walked into David Chen's office with the headlines still spinning in my head. He didn't look surprised. "He's buying himself time," David said, pushing a folder across his desk. "A PR team is feeding this to every outlet that will take it. But it doesn't matter. We don't play his game. We play ours." I leaned forward. "What do we do?" He tapped the folder. "We hit him where it hurts. Finances. We file a quiet motion for full discovery. While he smiles for cameras, we pull the rug out from under him." I opened the folder. Page after page of legal forms, each one a weapon sharpened against Daniel. My fingers steadied as I turned them. "Do it," I said. David smiled faintly. "It's already filed." For a brief second, the tension in my chest eased. He was fighting his war in the press. We would fight ours in court. 3 days later, the press came for me again. This time, they were waiting outside Liam and Chloe's school. When I walked out with the kids, a man shoved a microphone toward me. "Emily, did you cheat on your husband? Is it true? Daniel's not the father?" Chloe gripped my hand tighter. I didn't answer. I guided both kids into the car, my jaw locked, and drove away while the camera shutters clicked behind us. That night, Chloe asked why people were taking pictures. I kissed her hair and told her it was nothing, but in my head, I saw Daniel smirking while his lies poisoned my children's lives. The next day, David called me. "Come to the office. You'll want to hear this." When I arrived, there was a man waiting in David's conference room. He stood when I walked in, extending a hand. He was tall, in his late 30s, with tired eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Emily, this is Dr. Mark Vincent," David said. The name clicked. June's former fiancé. Mark nodded, his expression grim. "I was going to marry her. Then she left me for Daniel." I sat down, studying him. "Why are you here?" "Because she bragged," he said simply. "She told me everything before she walked out. The plan. How she and Daniel were going to frame you, make you look unfaithful. Force a paternity test and take your kids." She laughed about it, called it flawless. The words settled like ice in my chest. David slid a document toward me. He signed an affidavit. He's ready to testify if it comes to it. I looked at Mark. Why help me? His jaw tightened. Because I want her to watch it all burn. And because you don't deserve what they're doing to you. For a long moment, none of us spoke. I reached for the affidavit, my fingers brushing the signature at the bottom. Thank you, I said quietly. Mark nodded once, sharp and certain. Make them regret it. Driving home that night, the city lights blurred past my windshield. The headlines, the cameras, my mother's uncertainty, all of it pressed in, but beneath it, something stronger had taken root. They thought they were winning. They had no idea the ground was already cracking beneath their feet. And I would be the one to watch them fall. David's office was lit only by the glow of his desk lamp when I walked in that evening. A stack of files sat between us, thick enough to crush whatever hope Daniel might still have of escaping what was coming. Frank Miller leaned against the wall, his coat damp from the drizzle outside. He looked like a man who lived in other people's secrets, and tonight, he carried mine. We followed the money, Frank said, his voice low and steady. Cayman Islands, Zurich, Singapore. He's been moving it in small transfers for months, just under reporting thresholds. David flipped through the documents, his eyes sharp. Every dollar is documented. Every transfer tied back to accounts in Daniel's name or one of his shell companies. He glanced up at me, his mouth set in a thin, satisfied line. We have him, Emily. I stared down at the papers, the numbers blurring for a moment before snapping into focus. 120 million. He hadn't just betrayed me, he had tried to erase me. What happens now? I asked quietly. David closed the file and pushed it toward me. Now we build the trap. The next morning, Daniel was on every business network smiling for cameras. Marcus Hill, his lawyer, stood beside him like a shadow feeding quotes to the press about parental rights and the importance of truth. I watched it from my kitchen. The screen muted my coffee untouched. He was winning in the court of public opinion, but it didn't matter. Not when I knew what was waiting in the real courtroom. 2 days later, I sat across from David and Frank as we went over every piece of evidence. Marcus is smart, David said. He's going to bury the court in motions and stall tactics, but we are not giving him the chance to control the narrative. Frank slid another folder across the table. And this just came in. One of Daniel's Cayman accounts made a transfer yesterday. Not even subtle. He thinks no one is watching. I flipped the folder open. The arrogance in those transactions felt almost personal, like he wanted me to know how little he thought of me. I don't want him just exposed, I said. I want it in front of a judge so he can't talk his way out of it. David smiled faintly. That is exactly what we are going to do. That afternoon, David filed a sealed motion with the court. Inside it was everything the email from Marcus Hill titled Nightfall, the Forensic Accounting Trail Frank had traced across continents, and the proof that Daniel had been siphoning money while preparing to drag my name through the dirt. When I asked David if I could see it one last time before he submitted it, he handed me the binder. I stared at the front page. My name, his name, and a record of everything he had done. This will hold, David said. Judge Grant is not going to look the other way on this. Later that night, as I drove home, I passed by Titan Data Systems. Its glass facade gleamed against the city lights, pristine and untouchable. For a moment, I imagined Daniel standing in his office watching the world below, smug and certain. He didn't know the walls were already closing in. By the end of the week, Marcus leaked another story to the press. Anonymous sources close to the Carter family say Emily refused mediation. He was spinning his web tighter, trying to choke me with it. But the court filing was already in Judge Grant's hands. The day of the closed hearing, I sat beside David in the small wood-paneled room. Frank was there, too silent but unflinching. Judge Evelyn Grant entered her presence, commanding immediate silence. Mr. Chen. She said, I've reviewed your submission. Her sharp gaze shifted to Marcus, who was seated across from us, with Daniel by his side. Marcus straightened his tie and offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Your Honor, these allegations are an overreach. My client's finances are sound. This is a fishing expedition. David stood slowly, calm and precise. Respectfully, Your Honor. What we have is not speculation. He opened the binder and placed it on the judge's desk. Inside is an email from Mr. Carter's attorney outlining his intent to defraud my client. Along with it are forensic financial records tracking $120 million through offshore accounts. For a second, even Marcus faltered. Daniel shifted in his seat, the first crack in his polished facade. Judge Grant turned the pages slowly, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the documents. When she looked up, her expression was unreadable, but I saw it. That small, almost imperceptible glint of disapproval, directed straight at Daniel. I knew then. The trap was set. David leaned slightly toward me and whispered so only I could hear. We just handed him the rope. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I sat there calm and steady as Judge Grant spoke. I am ordering a full review of Mr. Carter's financial disclosures. Until then, these records will remain under seal. Marcus opened his mouth, but the judge's gavel came down once sharp enough to silence him. When we walked out of that courtroom, David didn't say a word. He didn't have to. I could feel it in my chest, a quiet certainty that for the first time, Daniel Carter wasn't holding all the power. We had drawn the lines. The war was no longer his alone. The first hearing dawned cold and sharp, the kind of morning where the air carries a chill that wakes every nerve. I arrived with David before the doors of the courthouse opened, reporters already crowding the steps. Their voices blended with the rapid clicks of cameras, but I walked past all of it as if it didn't exist. David stayed close at my side, steady and unshakable. Inside the courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums with tension. Polished wood-high ceilings, the faint smell of paper and coffee. Daniel was already there. He sat at the plaintiff's table, with Marcus Hill exuding that smug calm he had perfected over years of getting his way. His dark suit was flawless, his tie perfectly knotted. He glanced at me as I entered and smiled slow and confident, as if he was watching a defeated opponent show up for her own execution. June Parker sat behind him in the gallery, dressed elegantly in a pale gray coat. Her expression was composed, but her eyes gleamed with satisfaction, like she was drinking in the spectacle. David leaned down slightly, his voice low enough for only me. Let him think he's already won. I nodded once, folding my hands in my lap and fixing my gaze on the bench where Judge Evelyn Grant would soon sit. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Grant entered her presence commanding. Her gaze swept over the room sharp and clear before she took her seat. Marcus was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "my client Daniel Carter has endured months of uncertainty. He has grave concerns regarding the paternity of the two minor children in this case. For their sake, we respectfully request a court-ordered DNA test." I felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward me. Daniel leaned back in his chair, relaxed, almost triumphant. He probably thought this was his masterstroke, the move that would humiliate me into silence. Judge Grant turned to David. "Mr. Chen, your response?" David rose without hurry, adjusting his jacket. His voice was calm, steady, cutting through the air like a blade. "Your Honor, my client has nothing to hide. We will not oppose the motion." The room shifted. Marcus blinked just for a fraction of a second, his confidence cracking before he smoothed it over with a tight smile. Daniel's smirk deepened, his shoulders loosening as he whispered something to Marcus that made them both look certain of their victory. David continued, "We agree to the DNA testing. My client welcomes it." Judge Grant's expression didn't change. "Very well. The court orders the tests. All samples will be collected by an accredited lab. The results will be delivered sealed to this court and will be opened during the next hearing in the presence of all parties." That last sentence hit Marcus like a small but deliberate strike. He shifted just enough for me to see it. Daniel, however, didn't notice. He leaned forward, glancing at me with a kind of pitying satisfaction, as if he was already rehearsing the moment the judge would read the results aloud. I met his eyes and didn't look away. The rest of the hearing covered procedural details, deadlines, and motions. I sat silent, letting David handle everything. Every word Marcus spoke rang hollow. He didn't realize he was building the stage for his own client's humiliation. When Judge Grant struck her gavel, the sound was sharp enough to echo through my chest. The bailiff announced the room adjourned. Outside, the reporters swarmed. Daniel stepped into the light of the cameras like it was a stage built for him. Marcus close by June, trailing with carefully measured poise. Daniel smiled, delivering his lines perfectly. "I only want the truth for my children. I believe the court will see this through." I stayed back with David, letting the crowd focus on Daniel. Their flashing cameras captured him like a man at the height of his power, and I almost pitied him. Almost. As we walked to the car, David spoke softly. "He just handed us the knife, Emily. Now we wait." That night, I tucked Liam and Chloe into bed. Chloe asked if the men with cameras would stop coming to her school. I told her yes, even though I didn't know when. She believed me anyway. I kissed her forehead and stood by their door long after they fell asleep, watching their small, peaceful faces. Later, the doorbell rang. A courier delivered the court's notice. "A nurse will come tomorrow to collect the children's samples." Another nurse would go to Daniel. Everything official, airtight. The next day, the nurse arrived. Liam rolled his eyes but sat still for the swab. Chloe giggled at how ticklish it felt. I signed the form steady and unshaken and watched her place the sealed samples in a tamper-proof envelope. Across town, Daniel was doing the same. I could picture him smirking through the whole thing, certain it was only a matter of time before my world crumbled. But as I stood by the window that night, watching the rain slide down the glass, I thought of the results already locked away in a quiet file at the lab. And for the first time, I smiled. Daniel had no idea. His move would be the one that ended him. The days that followed felt like walking through a storm with no shelter. Everywhere I went, I could feel the weight of judgment pressing against my back. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when I walked down the aisle. At school, parents whispered to each other as they pulled their children closer, as if I carried something contagious. The worst part was watching Liam and Chloe suffer. One afternoon, Liam came home with his fists clenched, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. He slammed it onto the floor and sat at the table staring at nothing. Chloe trailed behind him, holding her favorite stuffed rabbit tight to her chest, her eyes wet, but stubbornly refusing to cry. I knelt down in front of her. "What happened, sweetheart?" She sniffled. "A girl at school said Daddy was right. She said you're bad." The words cut deeper than any headline ever could. I pulled her into my arms and held her close, my hand rubbing her back as I looked at Liam. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "I told them it's not true, Mom." They laughed at me. I kissed Chloe's hair, then reached out and squeezed Liam's shoulder. "I know it's hard right now, but I promise you the truth will come out. We just have to be strong until then." He didn't say anything, but he nodded, and for now, that was enough. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat in the quiet kitchen, staring at the headlines on my phone. They were all the same. Daniel Carter, the devoted father, fighting for his children. Comment sections were filled with strangers dissecting my life, each one more cruel than the last. My phone buzzed. "Mom." I answered quickly. Emily Helen's voice wavered. "I need to come over." When she arrived the next morning, she looked at me like she didn't recognize me. Her face was pale, her hands twisting together nervously. We sat at the kitchen table where I had sat with my children just hours earlier. "Emily," she began softly, "I don't know what to believe anymore. People are talking, the neighbors, the women at church. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Mom, do you think I would ever do what they're saying?" She hesitated. That hesitation hurt more than any accusation could. I stood, grabbed my phone, and opened my email. I pulled up the DNA results David had sent me. My hands were steady as I pushed the screen toward her. She stared at it. Her eyes scanned every line, and then she stopped at the bottom. 99.9999%. Her breath hitched. She looked at me, her face crumbling, tears filling her eyes. "Emily, I am so sorry." The words broke something in me, not in pain, but in relief. I reached for her hand, and she clutched mine like she had when I was a child. "It's not your fault, Mom. He wanted this. He planned it." Her tears slid down her cheeks, but her grip only tightened. "I should have believed you. From now on, I will. I swear it." I let out a long, shuddering breath and nodded. That was all I had needed to hear. Later that day, David came by with new filings for the case. When he saw my mother sitting at the table, her hand wrapped around mine, his brows lifted slightly. "She knows I told him." Helen straightened in her chair, wiping her tears. "And I believe her." David's lips curved in a rare, approving smile. "Good. That's going to matter." That evening, Mom stayed to help with dinner. She set the table with a determination I hadn't seen in her in years. She helped Chloe pick out her pajamas and kissed Liam's forehead goodnight. After the kids were asleep, she stood in the hallway watching them with misty eyes. "I won't let him win, Emily," she said quietly. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, I'll be there every single day." I knotted my throat tight, unable to speak past the lump of emotion lodged there. That night, for the first time in weeks, I felt the crushing loneliness begin to lift. I stood at the window, the quiet hum of the house behind me, and stared out at the dark street. Daniel could have his headlines, his press conferences, and his carefully staged lies. He could have the world believing him for now. But I had the truth. I had my children. And now I had my mother standing beside me again. That was the kind of strength Daniel would never understand, and it was the one thing he couldn't destroy. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse was already overflowing. Reporters crowded the steps, their voices merging into a restless hum as cameras flashed relentlessly. I walked past them, my mother at my side, her hand briefly squeezing mine. David and Frank were waiting for me at the entrance, their faces steady and unreadable. Inside the courtroom felt heavier than ever. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators. Journalists filled the back rows, notebooks in hand, waiting for the kind of headline that could break the internet. Daniel was already there. He stood near the front with Marcus Hill perfectly polished in his charcoal suit, every inch the picture of confidence. June sat just behind him, dressed in a cream blazer, her smile faint but unmistakably smug. Daniel turned when I entered, his eyes locking on mine. He smirked, slow and deliberate, as if daring me to falter. I didn't. David leaned slightly toward me as we took our seats. "Let him enjoy it while it lasts." I nodded, my gaze fixed straight ahead. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." Judge Evelyn Grant entered, her black robe flowing behind her. She surveyed the room with a sharp, measured glance before sitting. Her presence was calm, but commanding, silencing even the reporters in the back. "We are here today," she began, "for the matter of Carter versus Carter. As part of these proceedings, the court will now unseal the DNA test results as previously ordered." Daniel straightened in his seat, confidence radiating from every movement. June shifted closer behind him, her hands folded primly in her lap. Marcus leaned in, whispering something to Daniel, and Daniel chuckled under his breath. I sat completely still, my hands folded in front of me, my breathing steady. Judge Grant reached for the envelope. The room went silent. She broke the seal and unfolded the papers with deliberate care. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of paper. She read the document silently, first her face impassive. Then she looked up, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom, before settling on Daniel. "Daniel Carter." She said clearly, "The probability of paternity for Liam Carter is 99.998%. The probability of paternity for Chloe Carter is 99.999%. The words cracked through the air like thunder. Daniel froze. His smirk faltered, his jaw tightening as if the ground had shifted under him. June's hand, which had been resting lightly on the bench, curled into a fist. Her face drained of color. For a heartbeat, the room didn't move. Then the reporters erupted. Pens scratched furiously across paper, cameras clicked like a storm. I didn't flinch. I simply turned my head just enough to look at Daniel. He stared back at me, his expression blank, but I saw at the first spark of fear flickering in his eyes. David leaned back in his chair, his voice low and even. "That's checkmate on the first move." Marcus tried to recover. "Your Honor," he began. "There may be grounds to challenge the validity," Judge Grant cut him off with a single sharp look. "The results are from a court-approved lab, Mr. Hill. They are final." Daniel's hands clenched against the table. He didn't look so confident now. June glanced at him, her lips parting slightly, but he didn't meet her gaze. For the first time, I saw something I had waited months to see, a crack in his perfect mask. I kept my face calm. I didn't speak, didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than any words. Judge Grant cleared her throat. "We will proceed with the remaining matters after a short recess." The gavel struck once. As the judge exited, the noise in the room surged again. Reporters whispered furiously, their pens flying. I rose from my seat slowly, feeling every ounce of tension in my body unwind. My mother touched my shoulder gently, pride shining in her eyes. David smiled faintly. He doesn't even know what's coming next. I looked across the room one last time. Daniel sat rigid in his chair, his knuckles white against the wood, while June stared straight ahead, her face unreadable. I didn't say a word. I simply turned and walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking against the floor. This was only the beginning. The next hearing came faster than I expected. I walked into the courtroom with David beside me, his expression calm but sharpened by purpose. My mother followed a few steps behind her presence, quiet but unshakable. Daniel was already there, his posture rigid this time, no trace of the effortless swagger he had flaunted before. Marcus Hill leaned in close to him, whispering rapidly, his jaw tight. June sat behind them, perfectly dressed as always, but her hands twisted together in her lap, betraying a crack in her composure. Judge Evelyn Grant entered, and the room stilled. The bailiff called for order, and we all rose. When we sat again, David stood immediately. "Your Honor," he said, "our team has uncovered new evidence relevant to the financial conduct of Mr. Daniel Carter." Marcus shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a custody hearing. These financial allegations are unrelated." Judge Grant raised one hand, silencing him with a look. "Mr. Hill, sit down. If Mr. Chen has evidence that pertains to the character or credibility of your client, I will hear it." Marcus sat, his lips pressed tight. David walked to the judge's bench and placed a binder in front of her. Inside are detailed records showing Mr. Carter's transfer of $120 million into offshore accounts through shell corporations. We have bank statements, wire transfers, and forensic analysis from an independent financial expert. Judge Grant flipped through the documents, her expression unreadable but focused. Behind me, I heard reporters scribbling furiously. David continued, his voice smooth and relentless. "This pattern of behavior not only shows a deliberate attempt to hide assets from this court, but also speaks to the credibility of the petitioner's character as it relates to the welfare of his children." Daniel's jaw clenched. He turned toward Marcus, who was already leaning over his stack of papers, rifling through them like a man trying to put out a fire with his bare hands. Judge Grant looked at Marcus. "Mr. Hill, do you have an explanation?" Marcus hesitated. "Your Honor, these accounts are investments. Perfectly legal." David didn't let him finish. "Alongside these financial records, Your Honor, we are submitting an affidavit from Dr. Mark Vincent." The name made Daniel stiffen in his seat. David opened another folder. Dr. Vincent, a respected physician, was once engaged to June Parker, who now has a close personal relationship with Mr. Carter. In this affidavit, Dr. Vincent details conversations in which Ms. Parker admitted that she and Mr. Carter planned to discredit my client through fabricated allegations of infidelity while hiding substantial assets to avoid equitable division in divorce proceedings. The room erupted in whispers. June's face went pale. She glanced at Daniel, but he didn't look at her. Marcus stood again, desperate now. "Your Honor, this is hearsay." David cut him off, holding up the signed affidavit. "The statement is sworn, notarized, and corroborated by financial records." Judge Grant looked directly at June. "Ms. Parker, do you wish to respond to these claims?" The silence was suffocating. June's fingers trembled against her lap. For a long moment, I thought she would hold the line for Daniel. Then, like a crack in a dam, her composure broke. "He told me to do it," she said suddenly, her voice shaking. "He said if we made Emily look bad enough, he would win everything. He promised me I'd never have to worry about money again." The courtroom exploded. Reporters nearly climbed over each other to write every word. Daniel spun toward her, his face twisted in fury. "June, shut up." Judge Grant's gavel struck once, silencing him. "Ms. Parker," the judge said firmly, "are you stating that Mr. Carter orchestrated this plan?" June nodded, her eyes wide, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes." David didn't even look at me. He didn't need to. This was the moment. Judge Grant leaned back in her chair, her expression like stone. "This court will recess briefly while I review this testimony and supporting evidence." The gavel came down again, sharp and final. As the judge exited, I sat still, my heart steady for the first time in months. David leaned closer. "He just lost everything," he whispered. I looked at Daniel. His face was red with anger, his fists clenched on the table. For once, there was no smile, no smugness, nothing left of the man who thought he was untouchable. And I knew this was only the beginning of his fall. When the court reconvened, the room was silent. Judge Evelyn Grant returned to the bench, her expression carved from stone. I sat straight in my chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap, while David stood beside me with the calm focus of a man who already knew the outcome. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. His suit was still perfect, but the confidence he once wore like armor had vanished. Marcus Hill sat rigid next to him, his face pale, whispering urgently, but Daniel didn't respond. Judge Grant's gavel struck once. After reviewing the evidence and sworn testimony, this court finds sufficient grounds to take immediate action. Mr. Carter, your financial records and the sworn affidavit from Dr. Vincent, corroborated by the testimony of Ms. Parker, have established a pattern of deception. I watched Daniel's jaw tighten, his fists curling against the table. Effective immediately, Judge Grant continued, all of Mr. Carter's assets are frozen pending further investigation for financial misconduct. Additionally, due to this conduct and the credible risk to the welfare of the children, full physical and legal custody of Liam Carter and Chloe Carter is awarded to their mother, Emily Carter. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I felt my breath catch my hand, instinctively gripping the edge of the table. David's hand brushed against mine in quiet reassurance, steadying me. Daniel shot to his feet. "This is insane. She's lying. They're all lying." The bailiff moved closer, his stance firm, but Judge Grant's voice cut through Daniel's outburst. "Sit down, Mr. Carter." He didn't move. Marcus tugged at his sleeve, his voice low and desperate, but Daniel ignored him. Judge Grant's tone sharpened. "If you cannot control yourself, I will have you removed." Slowly, Daniel sat back down, his face red, his chest rising and falling in sharp, angry breaths. David stood. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we also request that the court refer this matter for criminal investigation regarding Mr. Carter's concealed assets." Judge Grant nodded once. "This case will be referred to the district attorney's office for immediate review." I glanced at Daniel. For the first time, his eyes flickered, not with anger this time, but with fear. Then Judge Grant turned to Marcus. "Mr. Hill, if you wish to protect your professional standing, I suggest you cooperate with the investigation." Marcus hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Understood, Your Honor." It was over. The gavel came down again, a sound that echoed like a door slamming shut. Reporters surged to their feet, the clatter of keys and frantic whispers filling the room. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice steady. "Mr. Carter, you are under investigation for financial fraud. Please stand." Daniel's face drained of color. He looked around wildly as though searching for an escape that didn't exist. When the bailiff's hand closed over his arm, he jerked back, but it was useless. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, metallic and final. Flashbulbs exploded from the gallery. The sound of cameras filled the air as Daniel Carter, the man who once thought he was untouchable, was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. June Parker sat frozen, staring at the floor, her hands trembling in her lap. I didn't move. I only watched. My heart wasn't pounding with triumph. It was steady calm, almost quiet. For the first time in over a year, I felt like I could breathe. David turned to me, his voice low. "It's done." I nodded. I looked behind me at my mother, who smiled through tears, and then at Liam and Chloe, who sat with her in the gallery. Chloe waved at me, small and tentative. Liam, for the first time in weeks, smiled. I opened my arms and they ran to me. I held them both tight, my face buried in their hair, my chest aching in the best way. For 10 years I had carried the weight of Daniel's shadow. In one morning it was gone. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was chaos. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but none of it mattered. I stepped into the sunlight with my children, my mother close behind. For the first time in years, I felt free. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new home in Tiburon, the breeze from the bay carrying the scent of salt and the sound of distant waves. The house was smaller than the one Daniel and I had once shared, but it was ours. Liam's laughter drifted from the living room where he was showing Chloe how to beat a level on her video game. My mother was in the kitchen humming softly while preparing dinner, her presence filling the home with a warmth I thought I had lost forever. The old house in Atherton had been sold. I left behind every room that held Daniel's shadow, and every memory that felt more like a wound than a chapter. For the first time in years, I was no longer haunted by the echo of the life I thought I was supposed to have. I opened my laptop and glanced at the emails piling up. My art consulting business was still new, but it was growing faster than I had dared hope. My first client had been a small gallery in Sausalito, then another in San Francisco, and now I had 3 new inquiries sitting in my inbox. I wasn't just rebuilding a career, I was rebuilding myself. A soft knock on the doorframe pulled me from my thoughts. Mom leaned against the doorway with a smile. "Dinner's almost ready. The kids want to eat on the patio." I smiled back. "Perfect." When she turned away, I lingered for a moment, staring out at the water. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in gold and soft pink. It felt like the kind of ending that didn't ache, the kind that promised something better, was finally here. My phone buzzed. It was an email from David. I opened it. "Justice never comes late. It only waits for the right moment. Be proud of yourself." I read the words twice, a quiet laugh escaping me. I set the phone down and let my hand rest against the balcony railing. He was right. Every sleepless night, every tear I refused to let Daniel see, every moment I had to fight, not just for myself, but for Liam and Chloe, it had all led to this. Chloe ran out to the balcony, her hair messy from play, her smile wide. "Mom, come eat with us. Liam's already stealing the garlic bread." I followed her inside, and for a second I stopped in the doorway watching them. Liam grinned up at me, Chloe waving her fork in the air like a flag of victory, my mother laughing like she hadn't in years. I joined them at the table, the warm glow of the patio lights surrounding us. For once there was no court, no headlines, no weight pressing against my chest. Only family, only peace. As the kids argued playfully over dessert, I caught my mother's gaze. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I told you he wouldn't win," she said softly. I smiled. No, he didn't. After dinner, I walked back to the balcony, alone for a moment. The water below shimmered in the fading light, and the city across the bay glowed in the distance. I closed my eyes, breathed in the cool night air, and let the quiet settle over me. Daniel Carter had lost everything. His fortune was locked in frozen accounts. His reputation was in pieces. Titan Data Systems had removed him as CEO. And I no longer cared enough to watch it happen. Because I had my life back. And it was better than anything he could have ever taken from me. I turned to see Liam and Chloe chasing each other through the house, their laughter echoing like music. My mother stood in the doorway smiling at me, and I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was free. If you believe that the truth will always find its way, even when it feels impossible, share this story. Someone out there might need to be reminded that justice does come. Sometimes you just have to be patient enough to fight for it.